Okay, so now we're going to talk about the last two models, which are the cognitive and the psychodynamic models. So, the main assumption of the cognitive model when talking about abnormal behavior is that it is caused by an individual's abnormal thinking process. From a cognitive perspective, humans interact with their world through their own mental representation of the world. In other words, how you see the world in your mind's eye, or how you perceive and think about your world and your experiences with the world. So, from a cognitive model perspective, if your mental representations are inaccurate, or if the way you reason through problems is inadequate, so meaning you're unable to reason through a problem, then an individual's emotion and or their behavior may become disordered or abnormal. Right? So it's focusing on those thought processes. So abnormal behavior is considered to be a result of inaccurate perceptions and poor reasoning or problem solving skills, according to the cognitive model. This model does assume that there's an interrelationship between the cognitive or thought processes and our emotion processes, right? There's a bi-directional relationship there. It's happening in both directions simultaneously, but the cognitive processes are what are the primary focus. Okay, so they do take into account some of those emotion or behavior processes, but they focus on the thought cognitive processes. This is the primary difference between the cognitive and behavioral approach, because a lot of the ways that cognitive and behaviorists look at things are very similar, but in the behavior model, they focus on observable behavior, whereas the cognitive model focuses on thought processes that cannot be observed. So here is sort of what the cognitive model kind of looks like. Some examples of negative thinking occur. Okay, so whether it be blaming yourself for a setback, you consider yourself to be inadequate, maybe only focusing on negative events, so being wholly pessimistic when thinking about the future, or even having a negative view of your own self worth, right? So the presence of any or all of these can lead to an increased vulnerability of depression. So, again, all of these things are thinking, ways of thinking, right? When you look at each of these examples, they're ways of thinking, they're cognitive or thought processes. And finally, we have the psychodynamic model. So, according to this model, disorders are caused by a conflict between the three psychic structures. We talked about this in Module 2, the ID, the ego, and the superego. Remember that according to Freud, conflicts between these three psychic structures create anxiety or other similar symptoms. So the psychodynamic model looks at abnormal behavior as a result of these conflicts. Okay. Now remember the ID, according to Freud and the psychodynamic model, the ID operates according to the pleasure principle, right? Focuses mainly on sexual and aggressive drives, impulsive behavior, right? So engaging in whatever you want right now, you engage in those behaviors. The ego operates according to the reality principle. So it balances the demands of the ID and the superego. And finally, the superego operates according to the morality principle. So your sense of right and wrong, and often feelings of guilt, right? So according to this model, the ego is what is constantly trying to balance out the ID and the superego. So let's look at an example. Let's say that Josh hates his mom because he was hurt by the fact that she did not listen to his problems as a child. Okay. The ID would look at this, it would view this as I hate my mother for not listening to me, right? This is the view of the ID, those impulsive feelings, the here and now, right? So I hate her, she didn't listen to me. The superego, the morality side of you, would state that hating your mother is wrong and immoral, right? So then the ego comes in and tries to balance both of these views. And it does so by pushing this feeling of hatred into the unconscious so that Josh is unaware that he resents his mother. Now, this conflict, which according to the psychodynamic model, Josh experiences unconsciously, this conflict is going to adversely affect his life. Okay, he may experience depression or low self-esteem and engage in a number of abnormal behaviors because of that. So the psychodynamic model would attribute those abnormal behaviors and these psychological disorders to that conflict that occurs, right, between the ID and the superego in this example. Again, just so you can get a little picture of what this looks like, we are going to have the ID, the ego, and the superego. So you have your instincts, your impulsive behaviors, your ego is your reality, superego is morality. If you have a healthy psyche, according to the psychodynamic model, the ego is going to be in control, right? So it will successfully balance out the ID and the superego. There's no conflict occurring. Okay? A neurotic psyche, on the other hand, is one controlled by the superego. So you're constantly feeling guilty and worried about everything you do, right? Things like anxiety, social anxiety disorders. According to the psychodynamic model, it would be attributed to you having this sort of psyche, a more neurotic psyche where the superego is in control. Then there's the psychotic psyche, where basic urges and impulses are not controlled because the ID is in charge, right? So, again, the here and now, impulsive behavior, right? Instincts, sexual stimulation, food, drinks, drugs, whatever you want, whenever you want it, right? Right now, right? So the ID is in charge in this case. And finally, there is the psychopathic psyche. So this is where impulses and urges are not controlled. So the ID is in charge, but it comes along with behaviors of causing harm to others. Okay. The impulse to cause harm to others is also out of control in the psychopathic psyche. Right? Okay, and that concludes our discussion on the first part of chapter 12.